Hello and welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Andy, and we're on location at Waterloo Farm Museum in Waterloo, Michigan, on a beautiful, if a little bit windy fall day here to talk about federal junior officers in the Civil War. Before we get started, I want to say thank you to the CWDD coffee grinders, the financial contributors who let us do what we do. If you're not already, we really encourage you to become a patron on patreon.com. Your contribution would help us out immensely. This episode today is a special one. We want to talk about federal junior officers during the Civil War, and that is a broad topic. We want this episode to be for the general public, for anyone interested in the Civil War to better understand federal officers during the war, but we also want this to be for reenactors and the living historian community who are either becoming officers or just want to improve their impression. Well, before we get going into what they carried and how they carried it, we got to talk a little bit about where officers came from in the Civil War. And again, we're talking about junior officers in particular today, though a lot of this will apply to officers of all ranks. But junior officers, your second, first lieutenants, and your captains. These are the officers who are most in contact with the men. All of these officers had to get their commission in the first place. In order to do so, they had to get it from either the governor if they were from a state regiment, or the president if they were a federal regiment. So that means they needed some political connection along the way. Early in the war, this would have often been that men who were influential in the community, men who could attract large amounts of recruits, would be given commissions. A great example is Rufus Dawes, the 6th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry. He went out and raised a whole bunch of men. He joined with some other people who brought in smaller amounts of men, and they became Company K of the 6th Wisconsin. Dawes, as the most important figure in that group, had been elected captain by his men, and when he showed up to the regiment, that was confirmed, and he became their captain. As the war progressed, though, the officers started to become less influential members of the community and more outstanding soldiers within the regiment. As officers were killed, they were discharged, they resigned their commissions or promoted, and the vacancies opened up at the second lieutenant, the first lieutenant, and the captain ranks. They were by and large filled by enlisted men from the ranks who were commissioned. So you would have seen different social standings, different social classes coming up into the officer ranks than you would have seen earlier in a regiment's existence. Additionally, as the war went on, as a new regiment was formed later in the war, 63, 64, oftentimes you would have seen a more junior officer from one regiment coming in as a higher rank into a regiment. So maybe you would see, particularly in USCT regiments, the U.S. colored troops, a lot of NCOs from white regiments took commissions to come in as junior officers in these units. Consequently, it is almost impossible to put your finger on one look of a soldier during the war and say, this is how every Union officer looked. There are incredible degrees of variation based on the regiment, based on the social standing of the officer, how rich or poor he was, where they were in the war. Soldiers in 1862 in the Army of the Potomac look much different than soldiers in 1864 and 1865. It also depends what the regiment was doing. Are they a frontline unit? Are they in garrison? Are they in winter quarters? Are they in an active campaign? All of these lead to this mosaic of looks that are out there, and we're going to try to parse through that today and just show you what was out there. Ultimately, it's on you as a historian or you, the general public out there, to look into the regiment that we're talking about and get a better idea of which of the options, which of the things we're talking about would have fit for that time and that place and that impression. Officers in the Civil War were expected to provide their own uniforms. It's a carryover from the European tradition that officers are gentlemen. Generally in Europe, officers were parts of the nobility, and a gentleman pays for his own clothing, his own equipment, his own gear. There were regulations on what officers were supposed to wear for dress and underdress. However, almost no officer followed it exactly, and throughout the course of the war, there's huge variation on that. Taking something like hats, you can see in front of me several different examples here of different kinds of hats that officers would have worn. You can see something as formal as the dress hardy hat here, and then you have an enlisted one, but with a hat cord. There's also a great image of officers from the 105th Ohio in the Army of the Cumberland that have just regular enlisted dress hats on. You can see something as simple as a civilian hat, here decorated with a 1st Division 2nd Corps badge, and then either an officer's forage cap or a kepi. All of these kinds of headgear have different pros, different cons. Some of them were seen as more formal than others. Obviously, it's really hard to keep a hat like this pristine in the field, even though this is the regulation officer's dress hat. On the other hand, a kepi or a forage cap, while it looks more formal than, say, a civilian hat, is less functional. And officers, over the course of the war, often started to slide more and more towards what was functional, what kept off the sun, and to a larger and larger degree, what kept me from being distinguished from my men and therefore less of a mark. Generally, when it came to coats, officer coats fell into three classes. One was the frock coat, the formal army coat that came down just below the knee, 9-run front, and this would have been decorated with the rank insignia. Now, the dress rank is the epaulets that you see in a few photos, but are almost never seen during the Civil War. By and large, what soldiers wore were the shoulder straps. And we talked about this at length in our episode that we did recently on officers' insignia. I encourage you to check that out. Another option for an officer was the commercial sack coat, like you see me wearing. This coat is still formal. I still have buttons on the sleeves and things like that, but it's looser fitting. It's more comfortable. I have large pockets that I can put things into. And this is much more akin to the kind of uniform soldiers are wearing today, and also looks much closer to the sack coat that by and large became the staple of the Union Army uniform during the war. So a soldier would stand out even less wearing something like this. Another option for an officer was a shell coat, which is a frock coat but without the skirt. So it still gives a kind of natty appearance, but it's more functional than the frock coat in terms of it doesn't have as much material, it's not as expensive. There's, of course, officers that wore variations on these, and you see pictures of officers in Zouave regiments like the 146th Pennsylvania or the 164th, New York, different kinds of sleeve braid, different kinds of cuts. Of course, you have officers like the Garibaldi Guard who have some sorts of ethnic looks on them, but by and large, officers wore these three kinds of coats. There's one other kind of coat that officers often wore, and that was the enlisted sack coat. Especially for an officer who is commissioned from the ranks, that was an easy one to wear. The other thing is, as officers were able to buy their clothing from the Army, so if they had a hole in their trousers or their coat wore out, they could just go and buy a sack coat or trousers from the quartermaster, and they would sew their insignia right on it. Again, it's cheap, it's functional, and then they realized these clothing did not last long over the course of the war. So being able to easily in the course of the war replace their clothing with the enlisted men clothing and put on the appropriate insignia made them blend in and made it easier for them. For trousers, officers were supposed to wear dark blue or light blue trousers with their service branch color piped into the trouser seam. However, officers would make variations on this as well. Some wore enlisted trousers, some wore fancier ones. You can see I'm wearing a French blue colored one. It's not the regulation color, but you see plenty of examples of officers making small personal choices. One of my favorite non-traditional types of clothing is Captain Hubert Dilger of the 1st Ohio Light Artillery. He was a battery commander in the 11th Corps. He was a recipient of the Medal of Honor for his actions on May 2nd at Chancellorsville, stopping Stonewall Jackson's advance. Hubert Dilger was a Prussian artillery officer who had immigrated to the United States, and he was called Leather Breeches because he would wear leather breeches as his normal look during the war. Obviously, these kind of personal choices are very unique. There's a reason that Hubert Dilger was noted for wearing this, so this wouldn't have been common. Yeah, sure, there are many things where you see uniforms where one or two people wore that, but it hardly makes it the norm. Most soldiers in the Civil War are carrying brogans, Jefferson bootees, right? Officers, you see many that are wearing boots, a lot that wear shoes. There's also an interesting trend out there of officers wearing shoes and having a fake boot cover over it. It's kind of a gaiter, but instead of white canvas, it's actually a patent, like a patent leather overlay, so it makes it look like you're wearing boots while you're wearing the more comfortable and lighter shoes. Kind of shows how much appearance played into officers. During cold weather months, officers wore overcoats, and you can see I'm wearing a U.S. Army cloak coat, which is the regulation coat for officers. Now you can see this is a distinctive coat as opposed to the light blue overcoat worn by enlisted men. Obviously it's dark blue. I stand out in this. Also, it's got toggles on it. It's meant to be worn over gear. It's easy for me to button this over my gear. This would have been an expensive garment. You see it often throughout the course of the war. However, not everyone could afford it, nor did everyone want to continue to wear such a marked coat. As the war went on, things like the foot overcoat or the mounted service overcoat became really popular with officers. Again, you could purchase them through the quartermaster department. They were much cheaper. You didn't stand out as much, and they had basically the same functionality. Officers were also prescribed to wear a sash. And you can see my claret silk sash here that I would wear as a captain of infantry, which is what I'm wearing today. Now, it's a dress uniform item, but it also had some functional purpose. Officers, of course, on parade, you would wear it, but also officers of the day would wear it crosswise over their uniform to indicate that they were filling the officer of the day position. Some other little items would be dress gloves. Now, one of the most overdone things in Civil War reenacting is gauntlets. And there are instances I've come across of officers who wouldn't have been riding who talk about gauntlets, but by and large, gauntlets are meant to be worn when you're riding. Officers who weren't riding would wear gloves. Now, there's discussions about officers in the Victorian times, would they have worn leather gloves on a regular basis or not? And that's an interesting discussion, but one of the things we certainly know they would have had are white dress gloves for parade. One of the more distinctive things about officers was their weapons. We're going to begin by talking about the most iconic officer weapon, the sword. The officer's sword was his badge of rank. It's what indicated that he was an officer, a gentleman. His job wasn't to fight in the ranks with his men, it was to lead his men. And because of that, he had a sword. Again, these go back to the days of chivalry and all of that great European tradition. But in the Civil War, we see one of the last wars where officers are carrying swords into the field. There's a wide variety of swords that officers are using during the war. The regulation sword you can see here in front of me. The 1850 foot officer sword was an American version of a French 1845 infantry officer sword. And this sword was the sword of the US military at the time. Not only did the US Army use it for their junior officers, but it was the officer sword in the US Navy, the Model 1852 Naval Officer Sword that was used by the Navy and Marine Corps officers during the Civil War. Also, the Model 1858 Marine Non-Commissioned Officer Sword was based on this sword, which, with both the Navy and Marine Corps version of those swords still in service to this day. However, the 1850 foot officer sword had limitations. It's a relatively short sword. It doesn't have a lot of reach. And if you're actually going to use a sword for combat, it's probably not the best kind. Consequently, many other kinds of swords found use by officers during the Civil War. English swords were particularly popular, and there's great examples of both English cavalry swords, rifles officer swords, and infantry swords from the 1820s and 40s that came into use. The Model 1822 cavalry officer sword, the Model 1827 rifle officer sword, and the pattern 1854 and 1845 infantry officer swords all were seen when used by both Confederate and Union officers during the war. Swords from Germany were also extremely popular, and many of them generally followed the Model 1850 foot officer sword pattern, but took many different liberties with that design. Solgren, Germany was one of the principal sword manufacturers of the world at this time in terms of quality and price, and they were very commonly found. Another popular kind of sword was cavalry sabers. You see here I am carrying a Model 1833 Dragoon officer's sword. Now, there was a certain class of officer that used these kind of sword. One of the most famous is Francis Barlow, who originally started out in the 1st Division, 2nd Corps as a lieutenant colonel and ends up as the commander of the division. He would personally carry a cavalry officer's sword because he saw the primary use of the sword as whacking stragglers on the behind to get them back into ranks. There's a lot of variations, and it has to do, again, with how much did these cost? What's the availability? Especially, you see thousands of officers coming into the war in 1861, and many of them are trying to get any sword they can get their hand on. And there were only so many regulation swords around. Even though American manufacturers like Horseman in Pennsylvania and Ames up in Massachusetts started to produce these swords in large numbers, the private market for these was wide open. Just like we've said with many other things, sometimes the Army was where the men would supply themselves from. Leftover weapons in the Ordnance Department could be purchased by the officers. And again, maybe an officer would purchase an 1860 cavalry saber because it was available right then when he got his commission in the field. Most officers in the Civil War also carried a revolver of some kind. The revolver was new. It only really come into service in the Mexican War, and you see its use in the Crimean War and the Italian Wars of Independence. By the Civil War, it was expected that an officer is going to carry a revolver. Now, at the beginning of the war, most of the men went out and bought as big a revolver as they could. The ones that were very popular, you can see here in front of me, the 1851 Colt Navy pistol, the model 1860 Army revolver, and of course Remington had its model 1858 large caliber ones. And there was also the Colt models that had come before, the Walker, the Dragoon. All of these are large, huge weapons. One of the things that's interesting though is as the war progressed, officers saw the use of revolvers, and you see the kinds of revolvers that are being carried start to change. What becomes more and more popular are smaller ones, pocket pistols, weapons that are often 5 rounds instead of 6 rounds, but are smaller caliber, easy to carry, much lighter. One of the weapons in front of me is the Model 1851 Adams revolver. It's a British revolver. It saw service in the Crimean War, and we talked about it at greater lengths in the Confederate handgun episode from a few years back. Next to it, you see a Colt 1849 pocket pistol. This pistol was great because you could just put it in your pocket. You can see that a small civilian holster would go with it. It's light, it's easy to carry. Another companion for this came out during the Civil War is the 1862 Colt Pocket Police. Again, very similar. It's a version of the 1860, but much smaller, much lighter. Instead of these several pound revolvers that officers are carrying at the beginning of the war, they start switching these small, light ones. Smith & Wesson made a series of revolvers that were extremely popular as well. All of these are a great example of revolvers that soldiers would actually carry in the field. And here's the thing, they realized they actually did need them in the field. While an officer's job in battle was to direct his men, still there are those moments where the units are broken and officers need to defend themselves, and a revolver is exceedingly useful. Elijah Hunt Rhodes, who is the adjutant of the 2nd Rhode Island at the Battle of Spotsylvania, is riding to deliver a message. A shell strikes nearby and his revolver falls out. And he talks about he wouldn't have gone back to it even if it was studded with diamonds. However, he comes up to one of the senior officers who's shot and dying. And Rhodes talks about how he took the revolver out of the officer's holster and put it in his own because he needed to replace his revolver because he realized in 1864 how important it was for an officer to have a weapon like that. There's also limited evidence for some officers carrying long arms during the war, but I can't stress enough that this was exceedingly uncommon. You know, I think about one of my favorite TV shows, the Sharp series. British officer during the Napoleonic Wars carries his Baker rifle with him at all times. That isn't what you see in the American Civil War. Very few officers would have carried a long arm of some kind. Occasionally you see an officer talking about carrying a Spencer carbine or something like that, but by and large, they're carrying a sword, maybe a revolver, and that's it when they're in the field. Beyond their uniforms and their weapons, officers would have had a lot of other equipment that they carried with them throughout the war. And in front of me, you see a representation of some of the things officers may or may not have carried. First of all, water. Officers need to get water, and by and large, many of them would have used a standard enlisted canteen. However, we do know that something like this Bartholomew canteen was in use at the time. You can see it's kidney-shaped, but it's got some unusual features. It actually has spots to put small charcoal filters. Men started to realize that it's at least better to filter out sediment and things from the water. This wouldn't have taken care of bacteria, but at least would have given the officers who purchased that cleaner water to drink. One of the other things in front of me are glasses. Now, glasses could be overrepresented in the Civil War hobby, but we know officers would have carried them. At least some officers would have carried them. You know, there's a great example, Lieutenant Dodge of the 101st New York lists the things that he carries with him on campaign. One of the things he talks about is his glasses. Now, if you're an adjutant, or maybe you're in charge of a skirmish company, or you're out at a picket, these are the places where you would have needed it. But an officer marching in the battalion line on a battlefield wouldn't have needed a set of field glasses. The glasses that are out there, by and large, come from France. That was the best place to get optics at the time. But you're only looking at maybe 4 to 6 times magnification, not the 25 or 50 time magnification you can get with some binoculars today. One of the other things here you see is a Officer's haversack. This one's leather. You see, I've been carrying my painted cloth, my oilcloth one. Officers had to do paperwork. There is so much paperwork in the Civil War Army. Quartermaster receipts and ordnance receipts. You had to do muster rolls, all sorts of lists. You had to write letters. And guess what? Officers needed a secure place, a waterproof place to keep that. So writing supplies, paperwork, things like manuals. These officers were citizen soldiers learning in the field. A great place to carry your manual is in your officer's haversack. Now, we're going to talk about food in a little bit, but one of the things is officer haversacks sometimes carried food in it, but oftentimes didn't, because officers didn't do their food the same way enlisted men did. The final thing I want to talk about with this is a pack or a valise, how officers carried their gear. It's really common to see officers in reenacting groups carrying a pack, and it's probably overrepresented because more likely officers were supposed to have their stuff carried in wagons, or they were supposed to have a servant carrying their stuff. Now, there are servants in the Civil War, but by and large, these officers don't have servants. Their gear is supposed to be back in the wagons. Something like a valise where they could carry their gloves, their sash, their commission, extra things like that would be back in the regimental wagon with the wagon train. Maybe they keep a blanket on them and have a short roll or a sling on it. However, they probably weren't carrying all their equipment with them at once. Of course, though, some officers would have carried a pack. As we said at the beginning, time, place, and whatever information you can find on the officer themselves and the regiment, of course, is the overriding thing. So this is a quick summation of what they're carrying. Now let's go talk about eating. Let's talk about food. Officers were, guess what, expected to provide their own food, just like they provide everything else. Part of their pay every month was for their rations, and they could draw rations from the commissary department if there was excess available. So on a campaign, they might be able to purchase them from the government. However, there's no guarantee of that. Officers were oftentimes feast or famine. In a fixed camp or someplace where food could be easily bought, they often lived very well. But in the middle of a campaign, think the Overland Campaign in 1864 or Grant marching towards Vicksburg, they're not going to have as much to eat. A lot of times you read accounts of officers begging food from their men because the wagons are far away, they're separated from their food, and the officers have no civilians around that they can purchase food from. When they did have food available, of course, officers had a much wider variety of things to eat, including, of course, getting stuff shipped from home. They could purchase things from the sutler, the man who followed along with the regiment, to act kind of as a post exchange or a PX in the modern military. Officers, if they carried food on themselves, sometimes would carry it in the officer's haversack, or they would keep it in a separate enlisted men's haversack just for food on their person. There's no rule on how they did it. You see both being used. In front of me, you can see I've got some examples of something other than the regular tinware that you see. Now, of course, some officers did use tin plates, tin cups, again, time and place, but a lot of officers would have had their stuff in a mess chest with the regimental baggage. And when they had a chance to get it out, they would have had their china, they would have had their silver, they would have had their cup and saucer. And of course, things like a small coffee pot, hot chocolate, coffee, tea, all would have been great treats for officers. Now, part of this whole discussion of food is who's making the food for them. Officers were entitled to servants. The number of servants you were entitled to have depended upon your rank. A second lieutenant would have had one. Obviously, as you went up the ranks, you were entitled to more. Officers were actually paid money for the rations for their servants, and that became part of their pay every month. They're expected to pay their servants out of that money. Some officers provided their servants from home. Some servants, though, by and large, these servants came from the African American communities, the newly freed communities that the Army ran across. These servants often stayed with officers for years. Going back to Rufus Dawes, his servant stayed with him from 1862 to 1865, and he actually followed him and ended up in Marietta, Ohio, near where Rufus Dawes lived. Clearly, the bond between these two men transcended just simply employer and employee. These were These were men who lived together for years in the field. And again, mind you, servants in the Victorian time was not an unusual thing. Most wealthy homes, middle-class homes, would have had a maid, a cook, things like that. Even on farms, it was very common to have hired farm help on. So while today we think of servants as very strange, it was incredibly common in the Victorian era. These servants would have been responsible for carrying gear, for upkeep of the clothing, the equipment, for preparing the food, for finding the food. And a lot of times for an officer who is mounted, maybe taking care of the spare animal or taking care of the animals while riding the spare horse. The servants played an incredible role for the officers because, again, the officer's job is to take care of their men, to process the Army's paperwork, to lead their men, and doing those mundane tasks like caring for the uniform and preparing and serving the food meant that the officers had more time to do their jobs. Now, of course, we're talking about food, we're talking about servants. One of the things that's worthwhile talking about officers is the vice, drinking. Drinking is a vice in the American Civil War, and while enlisted men often would go out and get drunk, they were forbidden to drink. They were breaking the law by doing it. Officers weren't, though. Officers are gentlemen. Gentlemen drink. And officers in the Civil War drank incredible amounts. Of course, there are individuals who didn't, individuals who did, but it was, there's many accounts of enlisted men talking about officers finding their courage in a bottle. Most officers in an infantry regiment in the Civil War, especially junior officers that we're talking about, would have walked. Unlike the British Army in the Napoleonic Wars of the Revolution, where many officers would have had horses that they rode to battle and then dismounted to fight, but by and large, junior officers in the infantry would not have had a horse. Now, there are some exceptions to this. Officers like quartermasters, who often were detached from the unit, dealing with the regimental train miles away, often were mounted. Also, adjutants were generally mounted. There's some great accounts. We've talked already about Lieutenants Dodge and Elijah Hunt Rhodes. Both talk about being mounted while being adjutants. Now, the drill manual talks about adjutants being dismounted for battalion drill. But a Civil War regiment in the field often is 400, 500, 600 men. It's very hard to be moving all over the place as an adjutant without a horse. And again, part of the adjutant's job was to relay orders and messages. We think about aides de camp from the brigade and division sending down orders. Well, you forget that oftentimes a colonel would have to send messages up to brigade. Well, guess what? A mounted staff officer is an easy one to send off. But again, this isn't common. Adjutants, yeah, they would have by and large been mounted, but the average officer isn't. He's marching on his feet every day, just like his enlisted men. We've talked about all these different gear, different weapons, different uniforms officers would have carried. And again, there's a lot of variation between the Eastern Theater and the Western Theater. There's a lot of variations between early war and late war. I talked earlier about that image from the 105th Ohio of true campaigner officers, very kitted out enlisted gear, very, very down-to-earth guys. But there's another image from the 21st Michigan that shows their officers. They're also in the Army of the Cumberland, same army, same time. And these officers look like they're from the Army of the Potomac. Frock coats, forage caps, or kepis. You see sashes, and they look very uniform and natty together. It just goes to show that there's a lot of assumptions, a lot of biases. People think, oh, Sherman's army and Thomas's army would have been very down-to-earth Westerners. Well, guess what? There are plenty of them that still dressed up nicely as officers. Just like if you go to the Eastern armies, the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James, there's a lot of officers that would have been very down-to-earth, just like there were officers that were very dressed up. There's a great image of officers from the 54th Massachusetts, famous regiment. Of course, officers are all white in that regiment. And they're a group together and they're wearing paper collars or linen collars. Those detachable collars, they're the mark of a gentleman wearing his dress shirt underneath. And it just goes to show that junior officers could be doing that same kind of thing. General Hancock is famous for wearing his clean shirts all the time. Well, junior officers also, if they were from that kind of background, and you think the 54th Massachusetts officers coming from, Boston upper class society, they would have wanted to have a detachable paper collar. The great thing about officers in the Civil War is that they had a lot more freedom to express their individuality than in many militaries that you see today. And I think You get to see that with what we've gone through today and the photo you've seen while we've been doing this presentation. I hope you've learned something from this presentation today. Whether you're from the general public who wants to know more about the war, a historian who's trying to better get in the mindset of the soldier, or a reenactor who's getting into the officer ranks and wants to do a better impression. I hope you've made a connection between what we've talked about and the images you've seen of the real guys during the war. For Civil War Digital Digest, I'm Andy, and we'll catch you next time.